We're proud to announce CISO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. CISO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CISO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP.
Welcome back to Security and Compliance Weekly, where we are talking about social engineering in the mind with Perry Carpenter. We are so anxious to get back into it, but we do have a few announcements to make. Security Weekly Unlocked will be held in person this December 5th through 7th at the Hilton Lake Buena Vista down yonder in Florida. You can hear keynotes from Alyssa Miller, John Strand, Leslie Carhart, and Dave Kennedy. Visit securityweekly.com/unlocked to register and check out the rest of our stellar lineup. Also coming up on October 21st, you can learn why zero-knowledge encryption matters. If you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, of course that's a webcast that's coming up on October 21st, or any of our technical trainings, register or look at the previously recorded sessions. Go to securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right. So I want to shift gears a little bit and pick up on some of the things you were saying in the first segment, Perry. And what I'm fascinated to hear you talk about and expand on a little bit is, especially given your background in biblical studies, I assume that means you at some point read the Bible, which is probably maybe an exaggeration in some cases. But being a person of faith myself, I have long believed that to coin a phrase, love must be sincere. That the idea of behavior modification and doing things just to look good or because it's the right thing is not as desirable as it's got to be from the heart. Everything you do has got to be from the heart. It's got to be sincere. The motive has to be in the right place. And in preparing for the show today, I went and found a talk you gave. I think it was at DEF CON in 2018 or 19. But you shared. You shared in the talk, and it was at the Social Engineering Village, that you had gone out and gotten tested and found out that you're on the autism spectrum. And that was a confirmation and a revelation because, as you describe in your talk, and I think we have the link in the show notes. I encourage everyone to go watch it after the show. But, just talking about the nature of how the response to social cues, how you're supposed to act and behave and respond and feel, frankly, based on all sorts of social cues, it's just not something that comes natural to you. And that's just kind of blown my mind in terms of, well, there is no such thing, or set me straight, as sort of intuitive and it comes naturally to you. It's all behavior modification, and that doesn't seem to be any less legitimate. So with that as a backdrop and picking up on some of the things you said in the first segment, I'm just fascinated to hear your thoughts on, is there such a thing as from the heart, or is it all behavior modification, or what does it mean to have it be intuitive and come naturally, doing it without thinking about it? I think you mentioned muscle memory in the first segment, but let's take it from there.
All right, let's start from a leadership perspective then, and I will mention one of the things about people on the autism spectrum is that virtually anybody on the autism spectrum really does have the full range of emotions. What they generally lack is the way to express that. There's something that happens between the feeling of that thing and the actual finding a way to express it. There's a psychological term for it called Alexithymia. I mispronounce it every time, but it is that it's the fundamental way that starts to come up. It then wants to translate through some kind of logic circuit, and then it somehow hits a brick wall. And so the expressiveness is really a difficult difficult piece, but there's a lot of really deep feelers that are on the autism spectrum. So I don't want to give the impression that everybody is a brick wall, because deep down they're definitely not, or we're definitely not. So I mentioned tackling this from the leadership perspective first, and you talking about making everything come from the heart and being sincere. What we've seen, especially during the pandemic, I think has inflamed a very valid discussion around what is somebody's motivation when they do something like a phishing training. Because we've seen what happens when their motivation is broken, when their motivation was just to try to trick people, to try to see how bad the situation is. And we saw something with a newspaper that sent out a phishing test saying, hey, that we're offering bonuses. We saw, I think it was a transportation provider that did something similar. And these people, that were on the receiving end of this were greatly offended because they were presented with hope. In this time of uncertainty and economic hardship where people were struggling, they were, really, really receptive to lifelines. And of course, the cyber criminals are taking advantage of that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the employer should take advantage of that in the same way with a phishing simulation. And there are times that I think you can, but there are times that I think you definitely shouldn't. And the times when you can is when you've built a deep relationship with your employees, where they know that they are going to be tested in these kind of ways. They've have been given a heads up that these are the types of things that cyber criminals are going to do, and so we're going to test you in that way as well. So be on the lookout for anything that looks like this. At that point, they're prepared. They've at least been given a heads up. They know that you're not trying to trick them. You're not trying to shame them. You don't have IT staff that are laughing at them behind their back. And that ultimately you're giving them the chance to build resilience to these real attacks that are coming. Where it fails is when that relationship has not been built and somebody's just doing this because they know that they can trick everybody. And that makes them feel good as the IT security admin, because I pulled one over and got a 70% click rate in my phishing program and showed how pathetic everybody was. That's not going to work. That's not a sincere practice of security awareness training and simulated social engineering for the benefit of the employee. And that's ultimately what we're after here, is what is going to best benefit the employee so that we're building them up, building the right resilience, getting them in the right frame of mind so that they can be productive, so that they can feel safe where they are, so that they're building the right kind of self-reinforcing culture within the organization that then ultimately reduces risk throughout the organization as a whole. So we can start there and see if you want to branch out and take that in a different angle.
Perry, I'm kind of curious because you're mentioning, we talked actually a lot about phishing training, which I think is one of the more, aggravating / egregious things that security practitioners do. And it comes across as antagonistic. I'm kind of curious, what does successful social engineering training and prevention look like? Like, whereas we're talking about these things, like what would success look like? Because we constantly fall back on phishing training and phishing, campaigns. But at least in my experience, I've never seen a phishing campaign that didn't at least have, some success. And you only need one person to click on something to actually, get access.
Yeah. Well, so I think phishing training is the de facto thing because it's necessary, right? It's when you look at all the different data breaches that are happening right now, well, not all, being a little bit too hyperbolic there, but when you look at the vast majority of data breaches that are happening, there are two reasons that data breach typically happens: is social engineering or human error, and then unpatched software. It really comes down to those two. And social engineering being the huge vector for that, and phishing being the kind of the de facto one that's being used the most. And so we have to build some kind of resilience there. Now, as you mentioned, one of the things that can happen is you can do that very ineffectively. If you're just going at it saying, I'm going to throw in phishing with my program, that's probably not going to be the best way to do it. what you have to start with is a sincere desire to help your people. So there has to be that empathy that's injected, going back to Jeff's first comment. If it's not coming from the heart, it's coming from a very programmatic standpoint of 1 + 1 = 2 type of thing. And that's very cold. It's very detached. Your people will feel that. Yeah. And when you think about it, your phishing program and your security awareness program in general is the face of security for all your people. Your CISO is not going to have the chance to talk to 20,000 individual people in your organization, but the content that you put in front of them and the testing that you conduct with them is touching every single person. So the CISO's reputation is on the line with the content and the way that they conduct training. So it needs to be genuine. It needs to feel sincere. It needs to feel relevant. And we need to treat people as people. When we talk about, I want to touch on one other thing that you mentioned, then I'll yield the floor for a second. You talked about the fact you're always going to get somebody. And I think that that's true. You're never going to have a 0% click rate in these things. And if you do, it's a fluke. You can't say that that's where we are, because the next time you won't be there. But what you can do is you can increase the resilience of the vast majority of the organization to where you're pushing that down so that it becomes much more of a numbers game for the cyber criminal. Because at the same way, one of the things that I see is people say, you'll never get 100% effectiveness with your human layer. You'll never get that 0% click rate, so let's just not do it. Well, if I were to take that with every piece of technology that I had, would it hold up to the same standard? I mean, you can look at a lot of different studies on secure email gateways, and we all know, regardless of which study you look at, they're not 100% effective in stopping phishing. So what you're doing is you're trying to get the best resilience rate with your secure email gateway and the best resilience with your employee so that you're not dealing with just one of those layers. And of course, there's other layers involved as well. And none of those are 100% effective either. So I'll yield the floor and see if we want to go into dig down a little bit deeper into that or go somewhere else.
Well, a lot of what I'm hearing, and I think we talked about it when we did our prep call. At least I have a note about it, so we must have talked about it. The whole sort of traditional concept of people versus process versus technology is sort of the three legs of the stool of cybersecurity. And I really think we as an industry, if not a society, suffer from the belief that technology will just solve all the problems so that people don't have to think. The technology should provide that coverage. I've been thinking about it in the last couple of weeks because, knowing that there's things like emphasis on social engineering, security awareness training, even though I know those are not the best terms, as I've learned today. But, probably 98% of this industry focuses on the technology. Maybe that's a little bit high. And there's a nod towards the people. And lately I've been thinking, in my career, especially as a QSA, as someone that goes into companies and tries to figure out how well their security program is working from a compliance perspective, I look at the processes. Do they have them written down? Are they following them? And I tend to think that the three prongs of the stool, the three legs, are not necessarily equal. They certainly haven't been given equal redress by the industry, but I kind of lean towards the process. And then you said early on, just trying to teach people to do the right thing for the wrong reasons. I forget exactly how you phrased it, but you implied that no matter how hard we try to get them to follow the clearly written rules, they're not going to do it. So now I don't know where we are. I'm stuck. Save
let me address that for a second. So your estimate of 98% is not too far off. One of the things we did when we were getting ready to go public as a company at KnowBe4, so let me speak on behalf of KnowBe4 for a second, not just me. we did a pretty deep dive into where security spending is happening, and regardless of the fact that data breaches have been going up and up and up over time, we've also seen security spending going up and up and up, but data breaches are outpacing the spending. So there's clearly some ineffectiveness in the spending, or people just aren't spending enough. But what we found is that 97% of the spend is happening on security technology, and less than 3% is happening on anything that has to do with the human. The other fun fact about that study is that when we looked at it, when you look at where the spending is happening, it looks like a very traditional perimeterized mindset of what security should look like. So the vast majority is in the network. Then some starts to go to web and identity and so on. There's very little spending that's happening thinking about discrete endpoints, or the fact that the perimeter is fading away, or the fact that every user is essentially their own perimeter that's out there in the environment at this point. And I think COVID just kind of inflames all of that and says that traditional way of approaching spending and the way of approaching the way that we think about the perimeter is just blowing out of the water at this point. So you talked about also this, people, process, and technology, and I had mentioned that if it feels unnatural, people are not going to follow it. What that means then is that we have a few choices. We can either start to build technology that naturally funnels people into the right behavior because it feels like the natural thing to do. And we can definitely do that. I mean, there's a whole field of study around UX design and other things that naturally allow people to behave in the way that they are wired to behave in front of the piece of technology that's given to them. So we can do a lot of work on UX design. We can also do a lot of work on process design to let people behave the way that they are naturally inclined to behave. But when we can't just let them naturally do the thing that they're going to do, you can get them to change their behavior through training. It just takes time and commitment. And then ultimately what you can start to do is you can approach all three of those and say, all right, how do we build technology that's going to help? How do we build processes that are going to naturally funnel things? And then how do we build the strength through training so that people can overcome whatever lesser hurdles we've now created for them through increasing their strength and the muscle memory and so on. So there's a lot that we can do on each leg of that stool to get it to where the behavior becomes much more natural. And there's also good news, is you can take an unnatural behavior and you can make it feel way more natural over time. I mean, the example that I always give is, if you've ever seen a kid try to brush their teeth for the first time, it's really awkward. They don't like to do it. They don't have the motor memory. They don't have the gross motor or the fine motor memory in place. And so they rebel against it. But now, however many decades in, we all do that on autopilot, where, most of us are pretty good at it. And so you can take this, what in psychology is called a system 2 behavior, very methodical. It takes a lot of cognitive load and so on. And you can codify that into a system 1 behavior through a wide variety of techniques.
No, I love where you're going with that, Perry. I'm actually kind of curious, how does that apply, especially if you think about some of the behavioral changes in training? Just to be upfront, people process information in different ways. So, for example, for somebody like myself, I have a likelihood to take things that another human says just literal, right? And then I have to learn, I have to train myself to be able to actually interpret things that are supposed to be figurative versus things that actually are literal. And I'm actually kind of curious, like, how do you actually deal with the spectrum of how people actually process and learn things when it comes to social engineering? And it's not just how we're wired, but it's also maybe even the cultures that we're brought up in.
Yeah. So, I'm really glad you mentioned the cultural differences that are there, because one of the things that I pay attention to from a social engineering perspective is this thing called the Ooda Loop. So OODA, observe, orient, decide, and act. So observe is this, taking in of all the telemetry data that's around us, the things that we see, the things that we hear, the things that we're presented, things that we smell, all of that comes in. And then based on exactly what you mentioned, which is our upbringing, the information that we presented, the industry that we work in, the type of education that we've had, the region that we live in, the department that we work in within our company, all of that helps us to orient around the data. And you will orient around data differently than I orient around data. There are certain phrases that I can say to one person and then say to somebody else, and we will hear those phrases or internalize those phrases completely differently based on the way that we orient around that data. And then ultimately, our brain decides what to do with that. We decide and then we act on it. So that understanding of how we contextualize information or how we orient information is critical for successful learning, but it's also critical for somebody that wants to social engineer somebody, whether positively, which is to change behavior to reduce risk, or negatively to breach an organization. And so I think understanding somebody's cultural differences, and we can do this at a macro level, understanding that somebody that is in an Asian culture might receive information differently than somebody in a Western culture. That's maybe step one. Understanding that somebody in the marketing department needs different information than somebody in the IT department, and somebody in the IT department might need information presented subtly differently than somebody in the marketing department, even if we're talking about some of the same facts. So we're not talking about role-based types of information dissemination or training. We might even be talking about the same facts that get presented differently based on the organizational context that somebody's in. Or, as you mentioned, based on certain learning styles or learning preferences as well, because some of the theory around learning styles, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and so on, a lot of that's been kind of debunked a little bit over the past 10 years, in that you can have very effective learning regardless of what somebody's preference is. But if we're talking about building relationship and getting buy-in over time, well, I do want to give you something at the right length, at the right tone, in the right context, all of that, so that you're more likely to want to engage with it rather than feel like it's, you're being slapped in the face with it.
But are not all those techniques of learning or preferences a means to an end of changing behavior? Or is there something else to learning?
Well, it's so there's two, I think that there's multiple ways of looking at some of this. Mm-hmm. So if we're talking general compliance, then there is information you have to expose your people to just so that you can check the box, regardless of whether that's going to change behavior or not. So we talked about that a little bit early on. You're going to have to show people certain policies, regardless of whether you actually believe that's going to change behavior or whether it actually would. There's also information that you share from a relational perspective. This is, the putting your heart in it, like we were talking about. There's the adjustment of tone based on preference and culture and so on that also builds a relationship, but then factors into how well somebody will receive the information and internalize it. Speaking on internalizing, are you using the Trojan horses for the mind so that they're more likely not only to relate to it and internalize it, but long-term retain it? And then ultimately, when we get to the behavior piece, there are things that we can do with information that will increase somebody's motivation, that will make a behavior feel easier, and or might remind somebody that a certain behavior is expected. So that fits in a behavior model. But then there are also things that we can just train muscle memory around, divorced of information, that starts to get us close to where things are. So there's a natural bleed over between these different disciplines that we're talking about. And then if we get into culture, it becomes even more complex, because now I have sets of unwritten rules. I have sets of maybe unarticulated information and patterns of behavior that have just been established because they're the behavioral norm for the department or the society or the company. And people, because that's being reflected so much, people internalize it, and it starts to build an internal value system or an internal behavior system that's devoid of the information that's given. And so things start to, once you get into the cultural nuance, things get even more interesting, because now I can start to create behaviors, I can create value structures, I can create rewards or even punishment systems if somebody wanted to go that route, with the way that the culture of an environment starts to treat certain behaviors or certain personalities and so on.
So I have a real quick sort of scientific question for you. We're talking about muscle memory, and I am familiar with that term. The easiest analogy I think is, when you're a young person learning how to drive a car, back in the days when you had to like crank the engine like we had to do. But like a manual transmission. Does anybody use those anymore? You're consciously thinking, foot on clutch, put gas, brake, foot off brake, turn, where do I have to put the knob to change to which gear? I mean, there's so many things. Look the mirrors, check mirrors. There's so many things, and muscle memory, and it's quite literally. I'm also a musician, a guitar player. I don't think of how to, what fingers go where to create a chord or strum. It's just muscle memory.
Yep.
I am assuming, and I'm asking if I'm making a wrong assumption, that muscle memory is a legitimate thing where we do things with the synapses in the body only going so far without going into the whole brain and thinking about it. It's a literal thing. Is it a literal thing in the context of what we're talking about, or is it more of a metaphor in terms of the behavior modification that we're looking for?
I think it can be a literal thing. So
wow. Okay.
I mentioned System 1 and System 2 thinking before. System 1 is this very fast heuristic-based thinking. So that is the the natural neural pathways have been created. There's a shortcut that's there. System 1 governs about 95% of our thoughts and actions. So System 1 is the thing that when you get hit with this phishing email that invokes all this emotion, whatever it is, that before you know it, you may be clicking the link to see what's going on. One of the examples of that happened several years ago is right after the Parkland shooting in Florida. A cyber criminal sent out a phishing email that said, "There's been a safety situation at your kid's school. Click here to get the news." And I would ask you, given all the the context around that second O in the Ooda Loop, given the context, the orientation around that, seeing all the news and everything else that had gone for several days, when you get a phishing email like that, you're much more likely, regardless of your security training or anything, you're much more likely just to let System 1 take control and click that link. But the good news is, if you're somebody that really starts to get good habits, then that little hitch right before you click on something can become something that actually happens, where you do naturally hover over it, or you think, "Oh wow, there's a lot of emotion here. Let me think about that differently." I'll tell you where it can break though, is when you learn a great habit like hovering over a link or something else on a computer, traditional desktop computer or laptop, full browser and everything else, and then taking all of that learning and applying it on a mobile device where the form factor is different, things are smaller, you're in a more to-go mindset, you have a lot of different emotions and other distractions around. Taking that same behavior set and applying it to a mobile device, you're basically back at square one. And so we do have to be aware of the fact that, yes, you can build muscle memory, but that muscle memory may not transfer between devices or contexts or mental modes or anything else. The other thing that I'll mention, there is some metaphorical use of muscle memory there as well. So I typically think about cognitive load, and I'll give you another example from the book. You can build great habits and you can train people to do the right thing. But if we go back to rule number 2, which is, or reality number 2, which is, if we try to work against human nature, we will fail. What you'll start to realize is that there are some things you just cannot train into people. An example of that would be something like password hygiene. You can train certain amounts of password hygiene into people, but studies are showing that people are now having to manage upwards of 200 different accounts on a yearly basis. And then I'll ask you, which one of us can remember 200 good, unique, long, non-shared, non-algorithmic, in our head-based passwords that somebody else couldn't, start to then come untangle, because we are using something like our name and our birth date and an exclamation mark. Once we train out of those and get really good habits around that, well, then naturally, there's no way you can remember 200 great, unique passwords. And what we then need to start to do is come in with a technology fix, like a password manager. Say you need to remember 1, 2, 3, 5, great passwords that are unique that we don't want stored in the password manager, but the other 195 passwords that you need to manage, let's just let this thing take care of the cognitive load for you, because it's going to do a way better job. And so you build the muscle memory to go to the password manager, not to do this thing that takes way too much cognitive load.
Fascinating. I'm just rethinking my entire existence right now, so don't mind me.
Well, I'm hoping it's in a good way.
Absolutely in a challenging way. Go ahead, Flea.
I was kind of curious just to keep going on this cognitive load aspect, and we talked about this especially in Silicon Valley, where everybody idolizes Steve Jobs. I'm kind of curious: are there shortcuts for cognitive load we can do for training that help people, prevent social engineering while also still being aware of the amount of information they have to process?
So, shortcuts for cognitive load, I think that there's ways we can bring technology into that. The password manager example is part of that. The other shortcuts you can take are you can develop a shorthand, or if we go back to that Trojan horses for the mind idea with something like imagery, the old saying is a picture is worth 1,000 words. The way that I say it is images are a compression algorithm for the mind. And so you can start to symbolize things that will recall certain patterns of thought for people. And a great example for this is a logo. If I see a Taco Bell logo, I don't just see Taco Bell. I think about my impression of Taco Bell. I think about my history with Taco Bell, whether that's good or bad. I think about whether I'm hungry or not. I might remember something 15 years ago when I was, at a certain location having a conversation in Taco Bell with somebody. So you can bring all of that richness back with one little image. And in fact, with imagery and something like logos, you can even take the words Taco Bell away and just show the shape of that, and it has the same cognitive impression. So with your security program, you can start to do some of the same things if you want to codify certain categories of thought or certain narratives within a specific image. You can begin to do that so that people just see that reminder and it comes up, and then it unlocks everything else that meant. That does mean that you have to take the time to encode all of that, and you have to find out if you're effective at doing it. But once you do it, you can start to then take advantage of those shortcuts. And all that is because there are things that I can present a quick picture, and your mind unlocks all of that within a second or less, versus I can give you paragraphs of something and it takes you 2 minutes to read, and you're going to go, I don't want to read that anyway. So if I can find ways to codify all of that and then unlock it in an instant, and then if we go back to the cultural piece, find ways to culturally reinforce that so that people are orienting around things using all of that context, then you can start to have greater efficiency over time.
So to try to pull this full circle, because we are a show that focuses on security and compliance, can you sort of give us any final thoughts on, given that so many companies are driven by compliance first, right or wrong, are there particular tricks or techniques or somebody said earlier Jedi mind tricks to help companies work through the compliance aspect in order to be secure? And then the flip side, if they're not bound by compliance, if they're just doing security for all the right reasons, how does that look, the same or different?
Yeah, well, if you're bound by compliance, there are certain things you have to do, right? So you're gonna follow that parameter as the baseline, and make sure that, let's say, people have to be exposed to a certain policy or type of information at least once a year, some kind of annual. So you might run everybody through annual training, or you might deploy a system that just knows whether person X has been exposed to this information within the past year. You could do that, and then you can start working with the way that somebody's natural mind works and expose them on a sliding time scale. You could do that. That's a little bit harder. You could also, through diversity of content, through having basically lots of different the same facts but presented in different ways based on culture, region, learning preference, and so on. You can deliver the content to somebody in the way that they're most likely to engage with, so that then you're not having to nag people for 2 weeks to say, have you completed this training? Have you completed this training? But you've given them to that either in a micro learning type of way where they're not having to invest a lot of time, or you're giving that in a way that they just like to engage in it, so that they're not feeling the burden of it as much. All those are ways to deal with that from a compliance perspective. And then, of course, you want to go into, from platform perspectives, when you deploy all that, you want everything to be as self-documented as possible, so it's not just a huge hassle to deal with. If you're doing this solely for compliance, and you're not interested in the security piece, then you just keep doing it the way we've done it for decades, right? You do the once a year training, onboarding training, and then annual training, and then you're done. Just know that that's not going to be as effective in somebody retaining the information, somebody internalizing the information, creating a value system around that, and then acting in that way. But you'll get your compliance done. If you want to take a security mindset around this, then you think about the behaviors that are going to have the biggest impact for your organization. You decide whether that is a single behavior. Let's say, if you said, I want to tackle phishing, well, that's not one behavior, that's several behaviors. That's being able to interrogate an email, be able to look at the links, think about the headers, think about the context, think about the emotion, think about whether this, even if this email doesn't have a link, might it be a business email compromise? So there's lots of actual things that you need to train and build behavior patterns around. And then you also have to decide, is this a behavior that your organization is willing to take on right now? Examples of things that they may or may not be willing to change behavior on would be something like tailgating. If your CEO likes to open the door for 20 minutes and let people in at the beginning of the morning, then you've got work to do with your CEO before you have work to do with your population. The other thing I'll say is we do have to make sure that we uniformly hold people to standards. And so if you say, this phishing training, this is great. What we know we can do now is if somebody fails a phishing test 3 times, we can just fire them and reduce our risk that way. I would encourage you to think twice about that, because if you are not willing to fire your CEO, if that person fails the phishing test 3 times in a row, then that's not a policy you should have. You have to be able to enforce these things universally, because if people sense a double standard, then they're just going to check out. They're not going to care. They're going to disengage because you don't have the relationship and the trust. So one of the biggest things you can do is build relationship, build trust. It's not just about decreasing phishing links. It's about upping, relation-based reporting. So if that's a phish reporting button, that's great. If that's an alert line where somebody thinks that something suspicious is happening and they call that, that's great. But they're not going to do that without the relationship and without knowing that there's some benefit to doing that, whether that's benefiting the company because they actually care about the company or benefiting them because they're just naturally going to feel like it's the right thing to do.
I guess my personal distaste for the current wave of security awareness training seemingly only being about phishing campaigns is, as you've described, there's so many other things that you could be touching on, even if it was a rotational type of thing, because it's like, that's not the only problem that the companies that I deal with have, is the phishing thing. And depending on what they're doing, it may be the least of their troubles.
One of the things I did early on in the book is I talked about the fact that when we talk about security awareness training, we tend to overly focus on cyber as well. And we forget to realize that there's a whole host of data breaches that happen because of behaviors where somebody's never touching a keyboard. They're leaving sensitive information on whiteboards. They're not destroying drives effectively. They're losing data backups, all of those kind of things. Those are very human behaviors that happen when something is not plugged in. And so we can't overly focus on any single behavior. We need to think about the ones that map into our organization's risk the best, the ones that are going to be most effective, the ones that we actually have a chance of changing, and then build our programs around that. And that may be in addition to our compliance programs. So we've got our thing that we do to check the box, and then we've identified our top 3 to 5 critical behaviors, and then we tackle those separately throughout the year.
So positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, both, neither?
I'm more for positive because negative tends to break the relationship. And so you can actually...
Cool Hand Luke style positive reinforcement?
No, so I'll tell you the positive reinforcement that I like. This goes back to the father of behavior design, a guy named B.J. Fogg, says you can actually create a behavior, you can create a habit instantly if you make somebody feel insanely successful about something. And so this goes into some gambling psychology and things like that. If somebody pulls the lever of a slot machine and they win the first time they ever did it, you've hit the variable reward system kind of psychology where somebody knows that, hey, pulling that lever is linked to some kind of reward. But they don't need that reward every time. They need it just enough, which is why you get people that just sit and continue to feed quarters or nickels into the machines day after day because they experience that once. They know it can happen again. They've had that dopamine rush. Same thing with reward systems for security behavior. If they see that happen to somebody else, if they've experienced a reward happening to themselves, or maybe reporting something that they thought was suspicious, or recommending a process change that would be more effective, or something else, and that gets rewarded, then they're going to seek that because that reinforces the relationship, and they frankly they like the dopamine rush of the reward. And even if it's not happened to them, if they've seen it happen to somebody else, they're going to naturally want to get that. As long as, here's the caveat, as long as it feels sincere. This goes back to your from the heart piece. Right. There's a phrase that I used to say is that reward without relationship feels repulsive. And so if you don't have the relationship and you're saying, look at Bobby, he did such a great job, or look at Jane and she did such a great job, it will feel insincere and you'll turn people off. So have the relationship before you start to implement things, or implement, your focus on intense relationship at the time that you do the reward system, and it's going to pay off way better than if people feel like you're disconnected and you're just doing it because some speaker told you to do so.
Interesting. I think that is a great note to end on, that the undercurrent is relationship for things being sincere, that I can chew on a little bit. Perry, thank you so much for joining us today and helping many of us sort of relive our Psychology 101 classes from college. I'm like, no, is that Skinner or was that Pavlov when he's talking about right that? but really has been a fascinating discussion. As I said in our show notes, is the talk you gave at DEF CON Social Engineering Village. You're out there more than that place. You were just at Layer 8 this past weekend virtually, right? You spoke there?
Yep.
That
was
so
a
go
good,
find Perry.
Good conference.
Very good. So that's going to wrap us today. Next week, we are inviting back Chris Penn, who joined us, I think, way back on episode 72. We had such a good conversation with him. We invited him back, so stay tuned for that. We talked about data security, compliance, and privacy law and things like that. Don't know if that's where we're going next week, but you'll have to tune in and find out. So that's going to wrap for us today. Until next week, stay secure, stay compliant. I'll close with this last dad joke, because we always start our segments with sound checks with dad jokes. Pavlov's dog to his lady friend. See that? Every time I salivate, Pavlov smiles and scribbles something into his notebook. We're out.